Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hi friends, welcome to the first episode of our next deep dive. Oh my gosh, I've been so excited about doing this one. So if you have read the title of this episode, you will know that our next deep dive is going to be on the theology of the body. This is one that I have been wanting and planning to do for so long. I basically have been obsessed with theology of the body for as long as I can remember. Not only with, the writings of Pope John Paul II, but also the way they've been expressed in the work of people like Christopher West, Jason Evert, who I remember hearing him speak when I was 15 and it blew my mind. So ever since I was really young, this has been something that I hold very dear and that I think is so important. And as time has gone on, it has just seemed more and more important to me. In 2024, I did a course on theology of the body with this amazing teacher. Shout out to Tatiana. What a legend. And I got to the end of that course and I was like, this truly is the antidote to pretty much all the problems of our society today. So yeah, I'm so excited to be starting this new topic with you all. So today, what we're going to do is a bit of an introduction to theology of the body. So we're going to cover three basic topics. The first is the question of what is theology of the body? And then secondly, why theology of the body? Why did it come about? We're going to look a little bit at the historical context of why Pope John Paul II wrote this incredible body of work and what it was responding to and what it arose out of. And then we're going to think about the relevance of theology of the body, not only to the time it was written, but also today. My opinion is that theology of the body is at least as relevant, if not more relevant today than it was when it was first written. It is such a gift to the church. So that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to start with the question, what actually is theology of the body? Because it might be a phrase that you've heard multiple times, but what actually is it? So theology of the body is a series of 129 addresses that were given by Pope St. John Paul II during his Wednesday audiences in the first 5 years of his pontificate. So from 1979 to 1984. These addresses all revolved around the theme of God's plan for human love. So they dealt with topics like human sexuality and the body and gender and marriage. The essential message of theology of the body is that the human body is not just a vessel. Okay, it's not like a car that I drive around in or a shell that kind of carries the true me around. The body isn't an object. It's not an appendage. It's not something accidental that I use or that I just happen to possess. The body is me. The human person is a unity of body and soul. Both are equally important to the human person. And the human body actually bears the signs of God's plan for human love and sexuality. Our masculinity and femininity are not accidental. They actually reveal something about our call to communion and to the gift of self. And ultimately, they reveal something about the very love of God and his relationship with humanity. So when we look at the theology of the body, we start to see how the church's teachings around sex and human sexuality, they're not just a set of arbitrary rules that the church has imposed on the human person. They actually arise out of what the human person is. Kind of like we found with the social doctrine, the way that the church's teaching on human rights aren't just arbitrarily made up. They're actually a natural consequence of what a human person is. And the same thing can be said of the church's teachings on sexuality. Okay, so that's what theology of the body is. Now, why? Why did John Paul II deliver 129 addresses on this topic? Clearly he thought that this was a big deal and it was something he needed to talk about extensively. Why is that the case? Why did he feel this was such a deep and urgent need for the world during his pontificate? Well, to answer that question, we need to take a look at the events that preceded the theology of the body. So the theology of the body was developed in the aftermath of the sexual revolution in the 1960s. and it responds to many of the cultural questions that emerged from that sexual revolution. So the 60s was a decade that kind of radically changed the way that society understood sex and the body. The big development of the 1960s was, of course, the introduction of the contraceptive pill. So the pill received FDA approval in the United States in the year 1960. And within just a few years of it becoming available, millions of women were taking the pill. So this was a huge thing. And for the first time in history, large numbers of people could reliably and conveniently separate sex from procreation. And that had enormous knock-on effects for how people thought about what sex is. Because over time, sex became increasingly disconnected from procreation. As the pill becomes more and more and more kind of widespread and normalized, people begin to understand sexuality and its meaning less in terms of like babies and procreation and more in terms of pleasure and intimacy and personal fulfillment and self-expression. And of course, all of those things are important to sex, like pleasure and unity between the couple, like that is an important part of sex. But once you remove babies from the equation, then that kind of is all that's left. And that becomes the focus of what sexuality is and what it's for. So increasingly, that became the framework that people were using. Sex is about pleasure. Sex is about self-expression and intimacy. And that shift in framework became one of the kind of driving forces behind the sexual revolution. Now, the pill didn't just reshape attitudes towards sex. It also became deeply connected to the women's liberation movement. And that's another major social current of the 1960s, this push for women to have greater freedom and equal participation in social life and education and careers and public life. And for many people, the pill was seen as a kind of necessary condition for women to have educational, professional, and social opportunities. Now, why is that the case? Well, if we think about it, pregnancy obviously affects women physically, socially, and economically differently from men. Like, it is just easier for a man to be able to walk away from a pregnancy than a woman in very obvious ways. And what that means is historically, women have at times disproportionately carried the costs of an unintended pregnancy. It was a lot easier for the man to kind of wash his hands of the situation and just disappear, and for the woman to then bear the costs of it, to be socially ostracized, to be abandoned. So for many people, the pill represented a kind of liberation for women, right? They were free from dependence on men and from the social and economic consequences of an unintended pregnancy. It was also something that the woman could do. She could take the pill and she wasn't relying on a man to use a condom. So Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of what would become Planned Parenthood, sorry, it's my knee-jerk reaction, explicitly framed birth control as a form of women's emancipation. So she said, birth control is the first important step woman must take towards the goal of her freedom. So she was drawing a direct line between contraception and freedom. So the pill has massive effects on society. Sex is becoming disconnected from the idea of babies. People aren't thinking of procreation so much as something that is built into the sexual act, and it becomes something that is optional. And as well as that, the pill is being sold to women as a form of freedom. Now, of course, the question is, does the pill actually lead to true freedom for women? Or does it just introduce a whole new set of problems? Because the contraceptive mentality ultimately treats fertility and pregnancy as like a problem that needs to be solved, or as a limitation or an obstacle that prevents women from being equal to men. And so the solution becomes removing fertility from sex, severing that link between sex and procreation. Now, on one level, that can seem to solve some social problems, but the question is, did this new paradigm, like this new approach to human sexuality, was it actually dignifying women, Or did it just like paper over some social issues while simultaneously radically reshaping the way that we understand sex and the body and relationships and human freedom in ways that were ultimately destructive? And of course, this podcast is Crash Course Catholicism, so you can guess what the answer to that question would be. So in the 1960s, a lot of people genuinely believed, like Catholics, believed that the church's teaching on contraception was going to change. Now, why is that the case? Because contraception had existed previously, obviously, but the pill was something different. So the church had consistently taught that contraception was wrong, but up until that point, most people associated contraception with placing a physical barrier between the man and woman. So something like a condom, for instance. So those physical or mechanical interventions, finding ways to interrupt the sexual act or put a physical barrier in the sexual act, that kind of stood between the husband and wife. And then the invention of the contraceptive pill seemed to be different from previous forms of contraception because in this case, there was no physical barrier between the husband and the wife anymore. They could complete the sexual act and there was no interruption in the same kind of obvious way. So to many people, the pill seemed like a more quote unquote natural, less intrusive technological advancement that could just help married couples to regulate their fertility responsibly. So, expectations started to build and pressure started building for the church to respond to this new situation. So for that reason, in 1963, Pope John XXIII established what became known as the Pontifical Commission on Birth Control. And this commission continued under Pope Paul VI and met for several years between the years 1963 and 1966. So it was a long, drawn-out process. And this commission included a variety of voices. So it included theologians, bishops, and also lay people, married couple, physicians. So there was a wide range of input into this commission. Now, this is a really important thing to understand. The commission itself did not have any teaching authority. It was an advisory body that was established to help the Pope to think through an incredibly complex theological, medical, social, pastoral issue. Because we need to remember that the church isn't a democracy, right, where doctrine is decided by like a majority vote. The teaching authority of the church rests with the magisterium, so the bishops in communion with the Pope. And the responsibility of the magisterium isn't to like invent new teachings, it's to preserve and hand on the faith that has been received. So the purpose of this commission wasn't to like vote on what the church should teach. The point was it was consultative, right? It was about gathering insight and information that could help the teaching body of the church to discern how this new technological and social development fit within the deposit of the faith, right? But within the teachings that had been handed down from Christ and the church's existing understanding of the human person and marriage and sexuality. But a lot of people didn't understand the commission in those terms, right? There was some misunderstanding about what it was, and many people assumed that it existed to determine what the church would change or if the church would change its teaching. Now, when that commission eventually concluded, it turned out that the majority of participants, so theologians, lay people, doctors, like all of these different voices, the majority of the participants had recommended that the church permit the use of the contraceptive pill within marriage. So this became known as the majority report. There was a minority report that argued that the pill did still violate the church's consistent teaching on contraception and it therefore couldn't be permitted. But the majority report recommended that the church permit the use of the pill. And then something really significant happened, which was that the majority report was secretly leaked to the press. And it became public before any official decision had been made by the church, before the Pope had responded, before the church had actually said anything definitive about the pill, this majority report was released, and people immediately assumed that the church's teaching was going to change, and it was basically inevitable. And the media framed it as though the church had already made this decision. So by the late 1960s, there was so much confusion, right? And there was this enormous expectation hanging over the Pope and over the church. And then in 1968, Pope Paul VI released an encyclical called Humanae Vitae. This encyclical directly addressed all of these questions surrounding contraception and the regulation of birth. And this encyclical was like a bomb going off, because instead of changing the church's teaching and permitting the use of the pill, Pope Paul VI reaffirmed the church's teaching. And he taught very clearly that contraception, all forms of contraception, including the pill, are intrinsically wrong because they deliberately separate the unitive and procreative meanings of sex. So Pope Paul VI reaffirmed the church's teaching that every sexual act must remain open to life. So if you deliberately close off the procreative dimension of sex, whether that's through a physical barrier like a condom or through chemically suppressing fertility through the pill, then you are acting against the nature and the purpose of the sexual act itself. Now, just to clarify here, the church isn't saying that every sexual act has to lead to pregnancy. It's not that like every time a couple has sex, they have to get pregnant or they have to be actively trying to get pregnant. That's not the case at all. And again, Pope Paul VI clarified this in Humanae Vitae, that it is absolutely fine for a couple to kind of naturally work with the rhythms of the woman's cycle. So to take advantage of periods where she's infertile, or to abstain from sex during times in the woman's cycle where she is fertile. That's something called natural family planning, and that is absolutely fine, because in that case, you're actually working with the human body. The difference between something like natural family planning and contraception is that contraception actually places a physical or chemical barrier in the way of conception. Okay, so these are the teachings that the Pope reaffirmed in his encyclical Humanae Vitae. Now, the reaction to Humanae Vitae was explosive. Many people were shocked and horrified and reacted with dissent, rejected this teaching, or even decided to kind of walk away from the Catholic Church, or to continue practicing as Catholics but to just ignore this teaching, because a lot of people had taken the majority report as though that was church teaching, or that was going to be church teaching. So there was kind of a bit of a crisis, and there was a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, a lot of pain. And a huge part of this crisis was the fact that this majority report had already been leaked. Because by the time Humanae Vitae was released, a lot of people's expectations had already been set. So it kind of felt like the horse had bolted for a lot of people. And so when Pope Paul VI reaffirmed traditional teaching, there was widespread confusion and frustration and dissent. So that was the kind of cultural backdrop. And this is where theology of the body comes in, because when all of this stuff was happening, there was a Polish cardinal whose name was Cardinal Wojtyła, who was to become Pope John Paul II. But he was not yet Pope, he was a cardinal. And he was observing all of this, and he had been thinking about these issues for years and years, because he worked a lot with young people and with married couples and engaged couples, etc. So he had been thinking about these ideas, and he was seeing what was happening in the church. And he recognized that the problem wasn't just that people disagreed with the church's teaching on contraception. There was a deeper issue here, which was that the entire cultural understanding of what the human person is, what sexuality is, what it's for, what freedom is, what the body is, all of that had shifted radically in the preceding decades. So Wojtyła wrote the Theology of the Body as a response to this cultural kind of crisis. And what he was trying to do was not just to repeat the church's teaching on contraception, but to offer a kind of deeper, broader vision of the human person and human sexuality, to kind of explain Catholic teaching so that people could understand what the church teaches and why it teaches what it does about the human person and about human sexuality. Because after Humanae Vitae, there were still these enormous questions hanging over the church. Why? Why is contraception wrong? Why does the body matter so much? Why is fertility so significant to the sexual act? Why can't sex just be whatever, consenting adults want it to be? So these are the questions that Pope John Paul II was responding to when he wrote Theology of the Body. So by the time he became Pope, he had actually already drafted much of what became Theology of the Body while he was still a cardinal. And then in 1978, he was elected Pope. And that kind of changed everything. It was so providential because he was about to publish the Theology of the Body. And if that had happened, he basically would have published these ideas in Polish, and they would have been an obscure theological work by some random Polish cardinal. They probably would never have reached the same global audience that they did. But now that John Paul II was Pope, he had this platform to share these ideas with the whole world. So instead of publishing Theology of the Body as a single book, he started to deliver these ideas gradually through a series of Wednesday audiences from 1979 to 1984, addressing the entire church and really the entire modern world week after week. And what he was trying to do in those audiences was pretty enormous. He was trying to build an entire theological vision of the human person, sexuality and love and freedom and marriage and the body, beginning with this question, what does it mean to be human? And it's important to emphasize here that it's not like John Paul II was coming up with a new set of teachings, brand new ideas. These were existing ideas that the church had taught, but Pope John Paul II was adding richness and depth and clarity to these teachings. So the Theology of the Body, even though it was responding to the situation around Humanae Vitae, it goes far beyond the question of contraception. It becomes an entire theological vision of the human person and the human body. And it's a vision that is extraordinarily rich and profound. It was deeply needed in the aftermath of the sexual revolution. And arguably, it is even more needed today. Because if we fast forward to the present day, a lot of the concerns that Pope Paul VI raised in Humanae Vitae now feel kind of prophetic. Because in that encyclical, Pope Paul VI warned that widespread contraception could contribute to the following: increased marital infidelity, a general lowering of moral standards, the objectification of women, so men treating women as objects for pleasure rather than persons to be loved and honoured, governments exercising coercive control over reproduction, and a growing idea that human beings have total dominion over their own bodies. And if we look around at the modern world, those concerns do not feel hypothetical. So many of them have come true. Today we live in a culture that is increasingly disconnected from the meaning of the body. We live in a culture where fertility is still treated as a problem to be managed, where sex is more and more separated from commitment and marriage and children. It's treated as a recreational act, where women are consistently objectified through hookup culture and pornography, where we're constantly kind of tempted to view the human person as an object that is malleable, something that I have total dominion over and that I can manipulate and redesign and optimize or use. So the questions that were raised by Humanae Vitae never disappeared. If anything, they became bigger and more urgent. And that is why the Theology of the Body matters so much. Because Theology of the Body is ultimately the church's attempt to articulate a profound and joyful vision of what the human person is, a vision of the body and sexuality and love and human dignity that is, yes, it's countercultural. It goes against all of the ways that modern culture tends to understand the human person, but it is joyful, it is healing, and it is so needed today. And I think that's what we're going to discover as we go through this deep dive. The Theology of the Body is so healing, and it speaks such joyful truth about the human person that is needed so deeply in our culture today. So that is an overview and an introduction to the Theology of the Body. In our next episode, we are going to begin going through the Theology of the Body. I can't wait. Whew. It's going to be great. It's going to be intense, but it's going to be so good. Okay, have a fantastic fortnight. I can't wait to talk to you soon. Okay, bye. Hey friends, thanks for listening to this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast and you would like to see it continue and reach many more people, then I invite you to consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the show notes of this episode. There are many running costs associated with running a podcast, and I rely 100% on the generosity of patrons. Thank you so much to those who already support the podcast. And most importantly, please continue to pray for me and for all of those who are listening.